session is Inclusive Policy Action for Transformation in Agriculture. My name's Melissa Pinfield. I'm a Senior Partner at Meridian Institute and Executive Director of the Just Rural Transition Initiative. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's session, which is co-hosted by the JRT, Just Rural Transition, with World Bank and the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. The Just Rural Transition was launched at the UN Climate Action Summit in 2019 to create a global community of practice on the evidence, perspectives and approaches that can help drive a just transition to sustainable agriculture and food systems. So we've heard a lot at AGRF over the last few days about the role of policy, how we need to have the right policy enabling environment in place. We need to create incentives through policies for the transformation of food systems to create resilient communities, food securities, and healthy economies and healthy planet. So today's session, we're going to really focus on what does it mean to have inclusive policy action? How can this unlock a just transition to sustainable agriculture and food systems? In recent decades, agricultural policy and public support has focused largely on increasing yields, specifically for a small number of staple crops, and arguably it's been very successful in this. Yields have risen 2 to 3-fold since 1950. But as we all know and we hear about in a lot of the conversations here at AGRF, this success has come at a cost to climate stability, resilience, biodiversity, and ultimately to food security. In addition, these support measures that have been put in place to accompany this have delivered very little in the way of value for money for helping farmers, many of whom live in poverty and are themselves food insecure. So more and more governments are interested in repurposing existing policies and public support to create more efficient and better targeted incentives to drive sustainable agriculture practices. So it's really important that those policy processes meaningfully include and reflect on the realities and experience of farmers and other stakeholders if we are to achieve this just food systems transition. So we need to hold space for dialogue. Someone with a huge amount of experience in multi-stakeholder dialogues and processes that accompany and support governments take action for food systems transformation is our esteemed keynote speaker, David Nabarro. David is the Strategic Director of 4SD Foundation, and I would now like to invite him to the podium to set the context for today's discussion.
The first thing to say, everybody, is karibuni. Welcome, welcome to this session. And if you would like to come a little closer to the front, you are so welcome. Don't hesitate to come across and come in so we make it more of a community. Why am I here? Why does Melissa say that I know about this kind of working? The answer is that I have been involved in systems and systems working really for most of my life. And the one thing that I've learnt about systems thinking and systems working is that it's really very complex. Many of the issues that we are working on when we're trying to do systems working are really contested and challenging, almost insoluble. How on earth is the world going to be able to have enough food produced to enable everybody to be well nourished, and at the same time, farmers to have decent livelihoods, women to be able to be empowered, young people to be engaged, and at the same time, the Earth as a planet to be conserved so that it is fit for generations to come? When you look at it, it just feels impossible, and even more impossible because leaders of different countries find it so hard to agree on what they're going to do about climate change or how they're going to stop terrible wars. And it's that dealing with impossibly difficult challenges that's really absorbed my brain and my heart for the last 5 decades. And I used to think, there's just no way. Perhaps we should just pack up and sit on the beach. But actually, there is a way. And we discovered it over the years between 2018 and now, and it's through organizing dialogues, building on traditional ways of dealing with difficult challenges, but open, constructive, respectful dialogues that are kept going constantly so that you don't try to solve a problem once and for all, but you keep exploring that problem, changing its shape, getting more people engaged. And although you can't ever say, we've done it, we've solved it, we found a solution, you can say, we're working on it and we're not giving up. And actually, the more I look at what's happening, for example, in this country and in other countries throughout this continent, I realize that this spirit of collective working is becoming much more widespread. So can we incorporate dialogue working into how issues are governed? Can we incorporate it into universities? Can we get it more done inside organizations? Yes, I believe we can. For the Food Systems Summit, the team I worked with was involved in supporting 1,600 dialogues involving 110,000 people in 150 countries to look at and explore their food systems challenges. And some people said, well, they're just going around in circles. But then when we got the information in from people within countries, they said, no, it's not like that. When you organize good dialogues, you unleash new energy and you get everybody looking at things differently and excitement is generated. And that's what we found, and we continue to find it. Because when we reviewed what's happening in countries for the Food Systems Summit stock-taking moment just 2 months ago, we found that the habit of dialoguing is continuing. So you say, well, that's all very well, but when you really look at what happens in the world, it's mostly people locked in conflict, usually men, and they won't get resolution. So I say, yes, if you focus just on social media, it's all about polarities and extremes. If you read the newspapers, it's all about battles. And actually a lot of politics that we're in these days is adversarial. But real life is about finding ways to deal with challenges. So lastly, a couple of words about principles for dialoguing that I would encourage. First of all, include everyone who needs to be there. And if you don't feel that you've got the right people, go on with the dialogues and widen the circles of engagement and make sure that everyone is there. Particularly make sure that poorer people, people who are not normally there at the table, are part of the dialoguing. Number 2, have a wide-angle mindset. If you're dealing with food, don't just think about production, but think about the environment. Think about nutrition. Think about, if you can, climate. And think about women's positions and young people. And then thirdly, always focus on where you're trying to get to and the incentives and investments that you need to get there. Use dialogues to engage, use dialogues to converge, use dialogues to explore, use dialogues to resolve, but all the time keep focusing on full engagement, full involvement, because in the end, that's the only way that collectively we can deal with the challenges that we're facing collectively in our world right now. So thank you for the chance to say these words. I look forward to staying connected. Enjoy the session.
Thank you, David. Always wonderful to hear from you and, reflect on what it is that we see that comes through these dialogue processes. I was in a dialogue on Monday that has been a process for 2.5 years now, the policy dialogues, and I think we'll hear about a bit more about that from Rachel from the UK's FCDO. And it's incredible how through that process things changed. It started off as one thing, and it's through this process, it's an ongoing process of dialogue that brings people in. And the other thing I'm really reflecting on from your remarks, David, is, we need these things that build the trust together with people and finds common ground. We have more in common, I think, than we sometimes think about. We often think about our points of difference or our own perspective. But when you hear from someone else and then you understand a little bit about what it might be like to stand in their shoes, then it makes you think really differently about things. So I've always enjoyed the food systems dialogues, and I'm really glad that they are still going and that there's more to come from there. Now, I'm going to keep us moving along and invite up our panel. We still have one panelist, I think, who's on their way. Also, just to note that we've been asked by the conference organisers to end this session early. So we're going to try and finish by 8:30, 8:40 at the latest, because there's a lot going on at AGRF today and they would like to reset this room. So let's bring the panelists that we have up onto the stage, and then Elizabeth can join us when she is arriving. So could I invite up, please, Richard Kachungu, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Young Emerging Farmers Initiative. And this year, Richard was also selected to be the program facilitator for the Obama Foundation's Leaders Africa program for the 2023 cohort. So congratulations, Richard. Boafade Elegbedi, who is Associate Director for Investing in West Africa at Acumen, and his background spans a decade of experience working in consulting, corporate strategy, and early stage investing and advisory roles. I'm really glad to have an investor in the room. It's always rare. We always talk about where's the finance, so it's fantastic that we have a finance and a young farmer in the room. So we are doing really well with this panel. We've also invite please up Rachel Waterhouse, who's team leader of sustainable water and food systems in the Climate and Environment Division of UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. She led the COP26 presidency campaign to accelerate transition to sustainable agriculture, which includes the ongoing global policy dialogues, which I just talked about, which is co-convened with the World Bank. So let me start, Richard, with you. At Young Emerging Farmers Initiative, you've trained over 10,000 young people on sustainable production, entrepreneurship, and business leadership in the food system. So what are some examples of youth success stories in achieving a positive change towards sustainable agriculture and food systems? What are some opportunities for youth empowerment and inclusion? And can I just ask all panelists, I think particularly for the online audience, to speak as close as possible to the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I think it's very important to also highlight that I'm a farmer. I think I don't usually say that in most platforms. I think people assume just because maybe I'm running an organization, I'm not necessarily a farmer, just representing farmer. I'm a farmer as well. Yeah, so I'll start with a success story, not just to blow my own trumpet, but I think the example I can give you is my own organization, Young Emerging Farmers Initiative. So I think Young Emerging Farmers Initiative was shown is an example of one of a success story that we have in the country, a youth-led organization that is working with young people and trying to transform the food system. In terms of creating resilience and transitioning to what we want the food system to be. The organization, given the limited resources that it has been able to establish a network of young farmers across the country. We have over 500,000 young people so far, both in rural and urban areas that are particularly interested to be in the food system. We have also created over 1,000 jobs. stimulating enterprises that are working around sustainable production and so forth. So we are a fine example of one of those organizations and a success story, doing a lot within the food system, working with young people. And we also involve ourselves in policy reforms, policy consultations with the government. We are very active in involving ourselves in national adaptation plans, policies around climate and so forth. But you should remember that these platforms are not just given to us. We demand these platforms, and we do that strategically. It's not the traditional way of doing things where maybe you are very aggressive, the civil society kind of demanding. We do it strategically, understanding that government is a key player in ensuring that we transform, and working together with government will also enable us to also foster this transformation given the environment that it could create. So we do that strategically, and we've been successful throughout that. But it's also important to highlight that young people have actually been thrown in a dilemma because we are told that we are key to this transformation and transition. At the same time, we are told we're not serious as young people. Again, the same people fail to create an enabling environment for us to actually even access maybe resources and so forth. And in documents, we are tagged as cross-cutting issues, forgetting that the fact that we are the majority. And sometimes I think that's one of the issues that always I think is at the heart of, at the bottom of my heart, where I find it difficult to understand. When you're creating a policy, you're supposed to target the majority of basically a country. And when you look at a country, like for instance, my country, over 75% are below the age of 85. And then you create policies that don't necessarily target them. Then who are you creating those policies for? If it's not for the country, then who are you creating it for? Because it's supposed to target the majority. Who are the country? So yeah, so that dilemma is also something that we need to also think about in terms of how we look at policy reforms and how we design these models and so forth. So in terms of the challenges that we've had, I think as young people, women in the food system, I think we should look at the aspect of capital. I think there's this, I think when you look at the capital, working capital that is required for one to actually run a business or an enterprise, it's quite a lot. I think especially for most startups, I think within the first 3 years of operation, I think you need at least 3 times of what you are requesting for you to actually run a successful business. So it's something that is an issue. So capital is a big issue, and I think that's something that farmers have been facing for some time. It's not accessible, it's not adequate, it's not even time bound for that matter. So that's one of the biggest challenges. Also talking about infrastructure in terms of physical as well as digital infrastructure. You're talking about having technology that is easy, simple, and is able to be used by a farmer, and not having any complications or challenges in using that particular technology. So infrastructure development in terms of physical and roads as well as digital is also something that has been affecting farmers in terms of this transition that we're looking for. As well as markets. I think markets, I keep on telling when I'm having these conversations about markets to say, why is it that this is the only sector where the person selling a product is told the price? I don't know. You walk up in a supermarket, you pick up a pen, and you tell the owner of the shop that I will buy this at $2 and something like that. So we need to also see how best we can work on those dynamics in the markets, in the food system, because that also speaks to how would transition in terms of encouraging sustainable production, because the pricing of those commodities will determine whether farmers will continue doing it or not. Yeah. So in terms of opportunities, I feel like there's an opportunity for us to actually come up with innovative financing. the financial ecosystem. I think there's an opportunity for us to redesign how farmers can have an opportunity to access these resources to be able to transition in terms of looking at mothering young people and women, for instance. I think to have it easy to access these resources, because this transition we are so determined to go towards, it requires resources, and it will require patient resource funding, or funding that is patient enough to ensure that this transition happens. And then we also have an opportunity to scale, looking at already existing initiatives. How do we best replicate these initiatives? How do we expand them to other areas to ensure that this is more successful? And then we also have an opportunity to redesign markets through policy, obviously, because I think one of the things that governments can do is negotiate some of these within these markets, go in there, have these arrangements and deals with other multi-stakeholders, and how best these markets can respond to the need of these farmers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. That's fantastic. Lots of things to think about there. And I think it actually segues beautifully to Boafado, the challenge that you set out about the need for more innovative finance. So I'm going to give Elizabeth a little bit of time to settle and come to her in just a minute. But Boafado, I guess, how would you respond to this, to a young farmer who's sort of calling for this need for this innovative finance? But I know our session today is really particularly focused on inclusive policy action. So, what would be needed, and how are you kind of working to influence policy, that policy enabling environment, also in a way that it facilitates these kinds of, sort of the work that you're doing as an impact investor, and being able to help women and young farmers that we've just heard about really contribute to food systems transformation. So over to you.
Thank you for that question, and thanks, Richard, for bringing in that perspective. So from our own side of things, through our own lens as Acumen and social impact investors, the challenges we see, just across board is, one that I think resounds across different players, from, policy framers to governments and members of the public sector, is, the irregular time horizon and just general leaning towards short-termism in terms of, bringing out strategy, bringing out, policy frameworks, and designing all of those with regards to how they apply to and are intended to basically bring in smallholder farmers. So in these parts of the world, there's the sort of like a desire by the drivers of policy, by the drivers of regulation and all of that, to map out initiatives in line with tenures of regimes and how long that is. But the truth is, the desired change we need and the impact we all desire for smallholder farmers and other actors in different value chains actually take time to manifest. So players at the upper level need to understand that. So we see that mismatch because we, on the investment side, we deploy truly patient capital, at the very least 7 to 12 years, right? But you have tenors that, are structured in 4-year cycles. So when initiatives are being rolled out, you're wondering, okay, how can you come in to even innovate around financing? And yes, I acknowledge that even if, Acumen, for over a decade, we've been at the forefront pioneering, support and investing in smallholder farmers. The truth is that we need more. It's a really big challenge. We need to galvanize more players in, more capital in, truly patient capital, and I emphasize on, truly. There's a lot of, not necessarily noise, but there's a lot of positioning out there of more commercially inclined capital, but somehow being packaged as, social and patient capital. When, these monies or types of capital get deployed in operationalizing those investments, there's always tension and friction between agribusiness SMEs and even smallholder farmers, that tension cascades down because the intent or well the expectation pre-investment doesn't align with how those investments are managed afterwards. It's more or less saying, okay, I'm deploying social impact, investing social impact capital and patient capital, but I'm managing investments and assets on the ground as though those investments are not patient, causing sort of like that confusion and friction between investors, even policy framers, and players like Richard. I think another huge challenge that we see is the fact that most of the food systems in these parts are not unmapped. So players coming in, and I'm sure you guys on the development side of things as well face the same challenge, is food systems are not mapped out by governments already. So you don't have, you don't have plug and play systems. But when you're coming in, you have to figure out, basically taking a few steps back the activity chain to really map out, okay, where are the opportunities, where are the crops, mapping out soil acidity levels across, different maybe geolocations and things like that, before you now then start thinking about actual commercial activity. You can imagine how much time and investments that will take for such what I say a challenge that needs urgent attention. Layered on top of that, with what we're seeing on ground is there's a mismatch between data that is being, what I say, paraded and published by public sector actors and what smallholder farmers and businesses that work with them directly on the ground are seeing. And this data and maybe research reports are essentially what is being, what I say, published across the world. They form the basis of discussion in different, what I say, in different rooms globally that influence and impact the policy discussions that will now then cascade down to these markets or these places in Africa. So that's another area where we need a lot more alignment. I think maybe to summarize at this point will be innovation that usually come out of intended innovations that follow policy direction here, when looked at closely, don't necessarily put smallholders at the front, heart, and center of the thinking. So you hear big announcements, you see rollouts, but when you just scratch the surface a little bit more, you see that mainly maybe big or maybe medium-sized players will find it easier to navigate and benefit from some of those policy directions that have come out. Yes.
Thanks, Bofade. We've heard from the young farmer perspective and an impact investor perspective. Elizabeth, let me now turn to you. President of the East African Farmers Federation, you're an agripreneur and a woman farmer as well. I'd love to hear about what inclusive policy action looks like for you. Are there some success stories? Have there been some times when you've worked with government to sort of shape that policy environment in a way that benefits those who are working on the ground? We hear a lot about farmers, women farmers, being agents of change. So what does good look like from your perspective?
I think there's so many questions in one, but I'll try to see how I can maybe shape my presentation to make sure that I address whatever questions that you've put forward. But just to start with is that the perception with most of the partners when you speak of farmers and farmers organizations is that these are institutions that don't have capacity. That is the perception. So we've tried to really see how we can turn around that narrative to show everyone that we are professionals. We are not just farmers, but we are farmers who understand the farming business, and we are professionals in that area. Because most of these actors tend to think that by just bringing us on the table and discussing without, involving us in the implementation, that everything is okay, but it's not okay. I want to say it's not fine. Because most of the times you use a helicopter view in terms of understanding the farmers' problems. You don't dig so deep. And it's us as farmers who understand what our issues and what our problems are. So what we've done as a federation is to make sure that policy is a key thrust area of our strategic plan. And we've made sure that we build the capacity of the farmers' organizations and our membership in terms of understanding policy in its totality. First of all, providing with them tools to be able to prioritize policy issues. And we've adopted, for example, the FACT methodology, which is the Farmers Advocacy Consultation Tool by Agritela, and we've domesticated that. We've also gone ahead, to get champions within our national farmers organizations, because not everyone is an expert. So when it comes to policy issues, then we have those policy champions that we put together so that they can dig into those issues depending on which thematic area you're looking at. Then the other issue is to understand the policy making process. When does it start? When does it end? And by so doing, then we've been able to align ourselves to that policy making process and be able to engage and interact with policymakers. I want to give a few examples of some of the things that we've done. As an organization, we've been doing what we call budget analysis, for example, for the East Africa community states. Every time the budgets are being read, we try and make sure that we do the analysis of every country. So that then, because our government's committed to the Malabo Declaration to allocate 10% of their national budgets to the agriculture sector. So we are saying which of our member states is allocating more resources to the agriculture sector. And we've been using that information to lobby other governments which are still allocating low resources to make sure that at least they have special programs for their countries. And in other countries, we've also supported our national level member organizations to take part in the national processes, policy-making processes. For example, in Uganda, through the new CAFE, the National Coffee and Agri-Business Farm Enterprises. It took lead in the coffee policy, which was later, passed by the Ugandan Parliament. In Burundi, through our member CAPAD, it's a national farm organization, Burundi never had a cooperative law. But we had a process of the East Africa Cooperative Societies Bill, which I want to speak on as I cross. So what we did, because we had this regional law, where we had invited all the member states, to contribute to that process. So we used that to, work with CAPAD to make sure that they lobby their government to have a national law on cooperatives. In Congo, they are working on the agriculture law. So we've been supporting our members. In DR Congo, we have about 5 members to make sure that they are part and parcel of that process, and they also engage with our government. Then the final one, which is I think one of our flagship regional program, is the East Africa Cooperative Societies Bill. Because we felt like you cannot have a regional integration without farmers integrating themselves. So with this law, we thought, it would facilitate the process of having regional mergers, having, cooperatives from different member countries working together to make sure that they address challenges that we've been facing, like the non-tariff barriers and so forth. So we pushed that bill as a private member's bill through the East Africa Legislative Assembly. The process was championed because, to be successful in policy-making process, you have to have a champion. So we pushed it through by the then Honorable Mike Kennedy Sebalu. He was a Niyara member of parliament from Uganda. It was presented and it was passed. But also before then, you have to understand the problem. Yes, we understood the problem was we as farmers organizations not, benefiting from the regional integration process. But then there's work that we had to do to make sure that we had the right information So we conducted studies before. We looked at all the EAC laws on cooperatives. Then we studied other cooperative laws like Ethiopia. We took our farmers to India to understand like the IFICO model, how it is working. Then we studied the UK law on cooperatives, and it informed our East Africa Cooperative Societies law. But unfortunately, till now, it's 8 years down the road, the law has not been assented to by the heads of states. And this is where I'm calling for the commitment of leaders. I think they need to really shed their egos. Otherwise, I didn't see ourselves moving, a step further. Because it was passed at a time when the late president of Tanzania, Magufuli, was coming into office. So when he came in office, most of the laws, he never assented to them. Much as we had lobbied all the other East Africa heads of states and they were ready to assent to the law, but because it was passed in Tanzania, then it has to be Tanzania, because it was the chair then, to sign the law first. So right now we are in the process of retrieving that law. I've met with Honorable Bashe, the Minister of Agriculture. There's goodwill from the government of Tanzania, and we are trying to see how we can reactivate the process so that that law can be passed. Key lessons. The policy-making process, with it, you have to be patient. It needs a full bottle, not even a half one, a full bottle of patience. Of course, you need resources. You have to mobilize resources in terms of the human capital, people who understand the law, who understand the process, who are champions. Then, of course, the money. You have to conduct all these public hearings. You need to do all the consultations at national level. So then, of course, you need all the resources. And you need a good team, a team that that doesn't get tired, because, like I said, you have to be patient. Yes, as farmers, we are still patient and we are still pushing on, and I hope one time we shall achieve and be able to celebrate this milestone. And when that bill is assented to, we shall call all of you to celebrate one of those bills that has been pushed by the farmers. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Some really great examples in there, and I'm really, really hoping that maybe in a year's time we come back at AGRF and you can tell us we got it through, we did this work. So thank you so much for that example. And I think there's that patience and the tenacity to keep going, and the resources, they're so critical. I'm going to turn now to Rachel Waterhouse. So we've been hearing a lot about just how much there is to offer by engaging in dialogue with those who have so much to contribute, to really understand the very real challenges that they face, but also the ideas that they can bring, and the learning and the knowledge that they can bring. So you were engaging in this policy dialogue on Monday. It's been going on for 2.5 years, but it's a closed door policy dialogue with governments only. So how does inclusion and inclusive policy design come into that process?
Thank you, Melissa. It's a very good question. So the policy dialogue, as you said, let me give it its full title. We're calling it a policy dialogue to accelerate transition to sustainable agriculture through redirecting public policies and support and scaling innovation. That's quite a mouthful, but to give the sort of the full scope of what we're talking about in this dialogue. As you said, it was launched jointly by the UK and the World Bank during the time that the UK had the UNFCCC COP presidency. And the context for launching this dialogue was the increasing evidence around the climate and nature crises that we face, and the impact, the vicious cycle with agriculture and farming and our food systems. And so we know, I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with some of the data on this, so that we know that agriculture and food systems contribute around 1/3 of emissions, and also contribute to kind of soil degradation and kind of overexploitation of the natural resources that, in fact, we depend upon to produce agricultural products and our food. So there's a vicious cycle whereby we're driving climate change, and climate change then and nature loss then has a terrible impact on the livelihoods of farmers and other actors in the food value chain. So that was kind of the context of we can't do business as usual. We have to tackle this climate and nature crisis. But we need to keep people at the center of that. It doesn't make the whole point of tackling the crisis is so that people benefit. There's evidence of this growing challenge in terms of climate and nature, but also growing evidence of the opportunities to address that through reshaping the way that public policy sets incentives and through reshaping public expenditure. I think you mentioned at the outset that over the years, public policies and investment have contributed to support agriculture sector, and we have seen incredible increases in output and production, more or less keeping pace with population growth, and so on. And yet we know that this can't, we're now on a downward spiral. So but there's growing evidence to show that if we sort of take these public policies and we think about the incentives that they set up, if we think about public expenditure and the way it's targeted, there's actually huge scope to shift that, to reform it, so that instead of unintentionally encouraging practices that are, in fact, are driving the climate and nature crisis, we can actually get incentives in the right place to support practices that are helping to restore nature, to lower emissions, and then at the end of the day will support long-term healthier diets and better livelihoods. But of course, policy reform is a really tough process. There are many stakeholders in the chain, and for farmers in particular, farming, we've heard from our guest today, it's a risky business. It requires a lot of investment and is very challenging to change the practices that you have when it's a long-term investment. You need that patient investment. So that's going to be very challenging if suddenly the government is going to encourage you to, for example, change the kind of crops that you're growing, the kind of irrigation schemes that you use, the kind of capital investment you make in your farm. Unless you can see immediate benefits, that's a really challenging process. So the aim of the policy dialogue is so this is difficult for governments to manage. They do have a lot of stakeholders involved. So we've got evidence that climate and nature need to be addressed, but we also know that people have to be at the center of that. And the aim of the policy dialogue is to create a forum between peers, a kind of a trusted space where policymakers can share evidence and experience that they see of the opportunities and of what is working to kind of steer this really challenging process, including experiences of how to successfully engage with stakeholders, how to build consensus and buy-in domestically for reforms. So through the policy dialogue, we first of all began, when you talk about policy reform, particularly subsidy reform, that's internationally, that's always been a very challenging issue. It gets people very defensive and it can set up a lot of tensions. So the first thing that we tried to do through the policy dialogue is to bring people into a safe space to talk about sustainable agriculture. What does good look like? How can sustainable agricultural practices deliver for people, climate, and nature? And through that process, we didn't try to negotiate a one-size-fits-all definition, but to get consensus around what good looks like, and to set out some guidelines and principles around getting to sustainable agriculture. So at COP26, we launched this policy action agenda, which is a set of guidelines and principles that really speak to inclusion. If we're going to make this shift, it needs to be an inclusive process that recognizes different needs and interests of stakeholders and needs to be context specific. From there, we've been developing sort of success criteria. Again, I referred to that people, climate, nature. If agriculture and food systems are sustainable, they have to deliver so-called triple wins. We have to have benefits for people and particularly for farmers. So from there, we've been trying to now dive a little bit more deeply into the different approaches, the different policy approaches that policymakers can take to get the results that we're looking for. So that can be around, for example, on Monday, we were discussing in a bit more depth what are the kind of policy shifts that can help incentivize and support farmers and other stakeholders to conserve water in their agricultural practices? What are the incentives that can help shift investment to protect and restore soil health? What other kind of incentives and schemes can be developed to protect ecosystem services? So these are the kind of discussions that we're having in the policy dialogue, but also not just sharing on the sort of, how can we get those technical shifts, but how do we build buy-in? How do we engage with farmers in a way that is beneficial, that farmers can also see the benefit, but are also able to help kind of shape the schemes, and that is also going to help them to get through that transitional phase. So, and there are difficult things to balance here. For example, the pace of change. I mean, some of the things that policymakers have been discussing in the dialogue. What's the best way to engage with stakeholders? Is it through a kind of consultation process, or what are the options to engage with farmers and others in actual design, in shaping the incentives, in shaping the metrics? How are we going to measure change? How are we going to ensure that benefits from the change reach farmers? And how are we going to support farmers through that sort of transition from shifting from one kind of support to another? So, I mean, I think there's obviously there's a long way to go. I think we've built a forum where policymakers can kind of share that experience amongst themselves, which is helpful in kind of having a safe space to talk about the challenges. And there's recognition that policy approaches need to be inclusive and flexible. I think nobody's got it right yet, but the good thing is there's really wide interest from policymakers to learn and to collaborate on inclusive policy reform. And I think Richard's intervention today and from Elizabeth is just really inspiring to show how much energy from farmers there is to engage in this process, and how much the kind of structured engagement that Elizabeth spoke about through the farmers' organizations, as well as the kind of the analysis that you're doing and bringing to the table is just so important to hear. So
thanks.
Just to conclude, I mean, I think that having this sort of space through the policy dialogue for policymakers to share quite openly about the challenges, but also to learn from each other about what's working in different countries is important. But equally important is this kind of forum where we're exchanging sort of with other stakeholders. So thank you.
Thanks, Rachel, for really telling us some of that insights from this closed-door policy dialogue process. And just to reiterate, the willingness of the Just Rule Transition, the community that we have brought together of multi-stakeholders, of farmer organizations, youth organizations, grassroots organizations and others, investors, we're really willing to find the way in which we can interact with these policymakers at this level. So it's very important, as we heard from Elizabeth, how it's working at national level and regional level, but also just to say, we can think as our community, the JRT community, how do we bring some of these stories, these case studies, these examples of what good looks like for inclusive policy reform to inspire, we hope, some of the policymakers in your dialogue, but also some of the frustrations, frankly, and things that have made it difficult that we really, really need to tackle and overcome if we're going to have this inclusive policy action. Now, I want to be inclusive, but I also want to respect the fact that they're asking us to finish early. So I want to return it to the audience, and maybe we can just have about sort of 5-6 minutes for Q&A. I have a gentleman here. I think we'll have a microphone to come to you for the online audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Sebastian Kingu. I'm a Tanzanian. The transformation I will talk because of time, I'll use maybe 3-4 sentences. We have designed a system, a new investment model focusing to the smallholder farmer. You know, in Africa, agriculture is about smallholder farmers. And the smallholder farmers have been pushed for so long. They are really at a mess. You know, the incomes, whatever. I've heard the young men there speaking. Now, we have a model, a new one, and we are looking for partners so that we can scale it up. This one will transform the smallholder farmers from merely raw material sellers to own large-scale industries. I'll give literal example. We want smallholder farmers for, let's say, cotton. They will own textile industries. Smallholder farmers for cashew nuts, they will own large-scale industries for processing the cashew nut. This means now, because 60% of arable land is in Africa, Africa now, we want to stop the export of raw materials. We want to process everything here under the ownership. The industries will be owned by the small farmers themselves. This is, I'm sorry to say, this model will use stock exchange and not cooperatives. So I'm inviting potential partners so that we can do this together. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. Thanks. I'll take a few comments and then I'll go back to our panel quickly. Thank you.
My name is Norma. I work in the finance industry here in Tanzania. I just want to say a big thank you to our speakers because what you were saying is really in line with what we are doing, what we see as well as people who work with smallholder farmers, but also deal with partners both internationally and locally. I don't have a question, but it's more of a comment that whenever we're discussing policy, I think one thing that we always tend to overlook is really the policy with regards to financing, especially financing in agriculture. Given that I work at a commercial bank, so I understand, especially with central banks, how we haven't really, especially African central banks, we haven't really found a way to harmonize and really see how best we can create financial solutions that can help these, especially commercial banks, to really provide the right solutions to smallholder farmers and the anchors, because it's the entire value chain that really needs to be looked at and given a special assistance and special consideration whenever we're looking at financial parameters. So for the DFIs as well, it's something that Richard also touched on in terms of policies for the masses. It's also important to have the masses within the right spaces, giving the right advice, given that we are on the ground. With that, I just want to say thank you again for the
Thanks so
panel.
much. Maybe, and then, sorry, this one, and then the gentleman back there.
Thank you very much. I just want to pick up, my name is Peter. I work for Global Environment Facility. I just want to pick up on the last speaker about the policy dialogue. I understand that this is a very long process somehow, and involving smallholder farmers getting their buy-in is a very important step, right? But also the question is, how do you get that same process to the policymakers at national level? Because I believe some of the things that we're struggling with in this space is what we call the policy coherence, right, at national level. So I just want you to reflect a little bit about, these policy dialogue processes, to look at the top-down and the bottom-up approaches, and how you see that in your experience and how that can be implemented. Thank you.
And just given the time, we'll have if you can just keep it to 30 seconds or so each. Thank you.
My name is Neva Zekea. I'm an innovator here in Tanzania, and I have developed the biopesticide for pest control, Folamiwem and Tuta absoluta. My contribution here from the speaker, especially Madam there, you talked about sustainable agriculture. And we are talking about policy action for transformation of agriculture. How are we including youth, especially innovators who are dealing in organic innovations? That is the one that is going to transform agriculture. We are talking about soil regenerative agriculture. Soil has been degraded. The one that is working best in the soil are the microbes, are the one that recycle nutrients, that decompose organic matter so that we get nutrient into the soil. So there are this innovation from young Africans. Many are doing this. I'm also the one. I have this is a microbial biopesticides. So we are struggling of getting this scaled up so that we can sell across Africa, because the pests are all over Africa. Fall armyworm is all over Africa, and maize is the main food crop in Africa. So how are you including this innovation? How are you financing these innovations from young Africans so that we can solve problem from our own solution or innovations? Thank you.
Thank you. So just the last one here, and then I'm going to come back. I think, Rachel, the question was for you, and then we'll have 1 minute each per panelist. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Nico. I work for GIZ, the German Development Agency. A question to Elizabeth and Richard. We've, I think, traditionally faced a model of policy making where we think in a policy cycle, but I think increasingly if we look at transformative processes, we don't look at reforms. You know, if we really look at transformation, that means change of systems, and the cycle becomes a spiral because it continues turning. Therefore, the role of evidence, I think, is also a different one. And I wonder what your experience is if you talk to policy leaders. What kind of evidence are they looking for? Yeah, we've heard a lot from a lot of CGIAR institutions here that are also addressing policy questions. What kind of evidence are you presenting to policymakers? You mentioned the budget analysis. And how do you perhaps also shape the consultation or your members' voices as evidence? Because that's also evidence. It's a different kind of evidence. It's not the scientific paper, but it is a crucial piece of evidence. So perhaps your reflections on this.
Thank you so much. Great. Well, I'm going to start from Rachel and then work my way back through the panelists, if that's okay, just for your maybe any reflections or responses to the questions that we've heard, and just your final thoughts as we move to close this session, you know, your final sort of key recommendation or key insight that you'd like the audience to take away. So Rachel, starting with you.
Thank you for the question. I think there was a question around how do we make the policy dialogue resonate at national level. So just to explain a little bit better what it is, the policy dialogue is bringing together, so it's a global policy dialogue, and it's bringing together senior policymakers from ministries of agriculture, from global north and south, to share experiences on the way that they're doing things. And the idea is not to, we know there's no one-size-fits-all solution to policy reform or to transformation, but the intention is to help share those experiences and build consensus around what good looks like and what we should be aiming towards, as well as sharing experiences on the kind of principles and processes, for example, the kind of inclusive processes that we've heard about today, how those can help us and what those look like. So that's the idea of the policy dialogue. I think in response to the lady who so eloquently told us about the soil health, I mean, I think it just demonstrates how much there is to learn from farmers, from people who are in the field. And I think, you know, the value of this kind of multi-stakeholder forum is just, you can't put a value on it. It's really, really important. I think there is a time and a space for both things. We need spaces where farmers can reflect and think together about the best way to engage with policymakers. We need policymakers to have that space to compare notes and see what's working and agree sort of principles and guidelines that work best to deliver this sort of transformation towards sustainable agriculture. So I hope that we can have more such discussions in the future. Thank you.
I think for us, we will keep, being at the forefront of, what we know how to do best, which is, supporting farmers and, the industry at large, and really being pioneers. So where, commercial capital won't go, will go. But keeping that in mind is, there's been a lot of arguments around, okay, what is the best, structures? What are the best instruments, in terms of thinking about innovative financing that is most suited or best suited for smallholder farmers or even SME agribusinesses in Africa. The truth is, there's no one size fits all. It can be social impact, venture capital, private equity, or even project finance um, structures and instruments. But I think one thing that resonates across, people on our own side of the divide is, policy has, I think, a big role to play in providing the very much needed comforts and maybe guarantees, so to speak, in galvanizing more and driving more inflows of that money that needs to somewhat, trickle down all the way down to smallholder farmers. And I realize that maybe in my tone has maybe more or less been on the negative side of things, but there are even there are positive case studies that we've seen in our portfolio. For example, one of our companies in Ethiopia, who very early on embraced partnership with policymakers and even players in the public sector, the government. The Ethiopian government at the time they started actually partnered with them for their first pilots. So this company provides, hybrid chickens to smallholder farmers through an outgrow program. And from that time till now, this company has grown, I think, about 200 to 300, X, and is responsible today for about 70 to 80% of the chicken consumption in Ethiopia. And they are in line by within the next 12 to 18 months, achieving in terms of consumption value that comes out of that company close to 1% of Ethiopia's GDP. So that's some of the would I say, like, the successes that can come out from close alignment between both sides. In Nigeria, for some of the companies, for example, a company that we've just recently backed, and even one, I think two companies that we've backed who play more along, providing infrastructure. One providing drying and storage hubs at farm gates across Nigeria, and another one providing just solar powered storage. And an angle or avenue of partnership that we're seeing is we're seeing what sort of like a behavioral change with players and actors on the public sector, where previously owned and operated assets by the government is being sort of like managed under co-management and cooperation agreements. And in the short time that these partnerships have gone on stream, we've seen sort of like a redirection or a reversal in multiple years of subpar performance of these assets, and it's beginning to look upwards. And we're very optimistic about what's going to come out from some of those partnerships.
Great.
Again, balancing the narrative is, you made a comment about how there's a lot of emotional, what I say, outpour, that comes out from when discussions are held around subsidy. We've had, similar experience as well. An investment we made in Ghana about 4 years ago. This company innovating around organic fertilizer, and about 2 years into operations, the Ghanaian government decided to roll out subsidies for synthetic fertilizers, making this company literally out of competition. And in all honesty, we've written off their investment today, and it's just as sad, even if it was well intended to make fertilizer more accessible and cheaper. But you can see how these things even out at the end of the day. So
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bofade. Richard, thank you. Oh, you can use this one. I think it wasn't working. Thank you. Yes, just I think we heard some questions here on, like, what evidence do you use when you take to policymakers, or just any other closing reflections as we...
Yeah, I think that was a great question. I think we've also understood that at times when you're in an ecosystem or a particular framework, because you do have to appreciate your opponent or the other players within the system. So we might have different way of looking at things, and what the kind of evidence that we present to government is usually scientific, evidence-based, given the work that we're doing as well. We'll also do a lot of research work as well, working with players like FAO, ILO as well, looking at different issues that young people are trying to bring out so that government can embed that within the policy frameworks. Yeah. And just to close my last remarks, I think it's important that different players from government to all necessary players within the ecosystem take a bold step, because this will require, because it's a complex situation. So for us to transition and transform, we need to make bold decisions. And at times, this might mean not everyone will win. And I think we need to realize that, because if you're talking about transitioning, we will not have everyone be happy or satisfied in a way. So we need to take those bold decisions. And at times, it might mean us who are providing this financing losing, so that the system becomes better. Yeah, so it's important that as we're designing these policies, these models, we look at least 4 key things. One, ethical implications, any fairness issues, unintended intentions. Secondly, user history or beneficiary history. What are the grievances of those particular people? It could be young people. How do you respond to these situations, and how do we enhance so that this does not repeat? The scalability. Is it able to accommodate the growing demand without compromising performance? And that's what we should also look at. Security. If the people do not trust what you're designing, it will be difficult for them to own it. So it's very important that we look at those 4 key areas. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yesterday, one of the speakers, actually Ismail from SACAO, the Southern Africa Confederation of Agriculture Union, said, I think we really need to start telling each other the truth. And for me, I think the biggest mistake that we do is our assumption that our politicians know it all, that they know a lot. I think we are not really understanding the political landscape and how these politicians, end up in representing us. In some countries in East Africa, some of the members of parliaments are just nominated. They're not even elected by the people. And in some of our communities in Uganda, where I come from, maybe some of them end up in parliament just because they're in the community and they're everywhere during burials, during, happiness ceremonies. So they're there, they are community people. So they end up in parliaments, but with no required skills. The minimum requirements for a member of parliament in Uganda is senior 6. So you can imagine that is advanced level. So you can imagine these are, and yet all our eyes are on these politicians to do wonders for us. So I think for us as a farm organization, what we've done, and especially the question that was raised by my colleague there, is to really look at politicians as people who are at the same level with us and who also need capacity and information. And that's why we've started with ourselves, building capacity of ourselves, and then going ahead to provide these politicians with information. For example, on all these, work that we've been doing, I'll give you another example. We've always done studies on the borders of East Africa, looking at the imports that are coming into East Africa, so that we develop an import substitution strategy. And when we go to these members of parliaments and politicians, we give them data. We say, look, these are trucks that come in, through Mombasa, through Dar es Salaam, on a daily basis. So what do we do? And these are the products that are coming in. This is where they are coming from. So what do we do? We need to increase production. So again, on the issue of being friends and telling each other the truth, we have, for example, the Africa Union and European Union. We always have these meetings. Just end of June, we had the AU-EU ministerial conference that took place in Rome. But then at times as farmers, we wonder what are the discussions that happen in such meetings. Unfortunately, I was not there. I was not able to get a visa because I had a short notice invitation. But then on one side, for example, in terms of policy, the Africa Union is here discussing a Abuja 1 declaration that said, we need to increase fertilizer usage to 50 kilograms per hectare. And on the other hand, we have the EU Green Deal that is saying, oh, we need to decrease, pesticide usage by over 50%. We need to decrease fertilizer usage by over 20%. So you ask yourself, what discussion do they have when they meet on the same table? And then why is Africa Union not pronouncing itself, for example, on the EU Green Deal? What is their position when it comes to the EU Green Deal? We have policies that have been introduced, for example, under that EU Green Deal, the deforestation strategy, the economical sustainability strategy, the farm to fork strategy. All these are going to impact farmers in Eastern Africa and in Africa as a whole, because Europe is our main trading bloc. So what happens? I think we really need to be frank, and we need to be open. We need to have, dialogue, inclusive dialogue, and make sure. And this is where we are saying we need every stakeholder on board, because politicians don't know it all. Maybe other actors might have more information. We've done a study, the first one, on the impact of the EU Green Deal on farmers in East Africa. I invite you to visit our website and read about us and about that study. We're also available to, provide you any more information that you might need. Finally, we've also engaged the EU, DG INTPA. We've been to Brussels to discuss that and how it's going to impact us as farmers. We visited the Organization of Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific States. We've met the Committee on Trade and Commodities, and we're saying, look, you are our representatives here. What are you discussing on our behalf? And I think that is the push that we really need from every actor to make sure that we have policies that can be implementable. Otherwise, we shall have policies that are just there, on our shelves and cannot be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Can I ask you to give all of our panelists a round of applause? Thank you, Rachel, Bofada, Richard, and Elizabeth. So much to take home there. We've really got to ask more of our political leaders, right, and mobilize and speak truth. We're going to just have one final closing speaker. Chris Hemmel has been sitting quietly listening to this conversation. You have a huge responsibility. Thank you so much to the COP28 presidency for putting food systems so prominently on the agenda. I'd love to hear your reflections on today's discussions and the plans for COP28. Thanks.
It's great to hear that back from you, that energy early in the morning. I understand that we are, frankly, under the gun in terms of time and that we have to finish early. I will not keep us. I'll be brief, and I will just come with really two messages, two reflections. The first is just to communicate that the UAE is a full-throated champion of this broad discussion that we're having at this event. The concept of food systems resonates very strongly with our leadership and with our population. Coming from an environment that is not a traditional agriculture producer, and yet has 20,000 smallholder farmers, has several large population centers, is dependent significantly on importing food, has to use innovation as a mechanism to be able to further explore production domestically. We understand that it's a much broader concept than just productivity and production, that it's a system, and that the entire system, whether it's processing, trade, the interlinkages between those things have to be addressed and discussed, and that we have to approach this problem through that frame. And so, for example, when you look at our domestic setup, we have a Ministry of Climate Change and Environment that also handles the brief for food security and for food systems within the country. That's to say, we've already integrated at the highest level possible in terms of policy this notion of the interlinkages between food and how it relates to climate. That's message number one, that we're here because we believe in this frame and we want to support it. The second message relating to the theme of this panel is that we want to use this moment, this platform we have at COP28, to try to make a policy contribution at the global level, which, as we've heard, it's hard enough to be able to make these changes effectively at the domestic level, at the regional level, at the national level. So to try to do this at the global level, we understand and appreciate is very ambitious, but it's a contribution we want to try to make because we believe in this frame of food systems. So, Elizabeth, to your point, we're going to go to the champion level. Rachel, you had mentioned there are many levels in this chain of policy creation. We're going to target our effort at the very top with a leader's declaration on food systems and climate action. Not looking at one segment of the system, but the system in its entirety. And ask leaders to be able to come together through a policy statement of action that recognizes the totality of the system and the reality of the interlinkages with climate. We are, after all, a climate conference. That has to be the lens with which we approach this. Just to close, we have been doing our best over the last 12 months to listen to this community. 15 plus consultations, many held with our senior leadership and the community. We've participated in all of the regional exchanges and consultations from the UN Food System Summit process this year. So we've really done our best to hear and to listen and to try to bring the community along with us so that we can put on the table something that's new, which is this recognition of food systems and climate, to try to set the table for action over the next 2 years going up to COP30, and then to close out the decade to try to achieve something during the Sustainable Development period. So thank you, and we really look forward to welcoming you in Dubai in just a few months, and to working with you over the next few months to try to get this declaration done so that it can be meaningful for all of us at that highest possible political level. Thank you.
Well, that's it for this morning's session. Thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you to our 2 guest speakers and to our panelists and to you, the audience, including those listening online. And with that, I will draw this session to an end. Thank you.